Poinsettia, Chapter 16. Down came the gavel. Mr. McLaughlin called out, "I now call this meeting to order." "Should I read the minutes?" Mr. Border asked. "No. We're going to make this quick and simple. We have come together to vote out Lord McIntyre as the president of the Board of Trustees. So let's get right down to it." He brought down the gavel again. It was such a powerful blow that it sent a vibration up the walls, reverberating the sound. Onto the table floated a single red leaf from the poinsettia in the center of the table. "Let's begin. I second the motion to remove Lord Gavin McIntyre," Lord McCarran chimed in. "All for?" from Mr. McLaughlin. 9 hands went up. That was everybody except 2. One, being Gavin, was absent, and the other... Mr. McLaughlin glared at Mr. Borders. "All opposed?" That lonely little hand went up. "Mr. Borders, are you absolutely foolish?" "I'm a loyal person," Mr. Borders stated. "Your loyalty to him is not sitting well with us. Nevertheless, it is no matter. You are outvoted 9-1. Majority rules." "Actually, this democracy is, when in a crisis, under martial law and ruled by a dictatorship. Really, there is only one opinion that matters in the end, and it is mine." Everyone turned to see Gavin leaning against the wooden wardrobe and lighting a cigarette. No one had seen or heard him come in. Where did he come from? "Lord McIntyre!" Mr. McLaughlin gasped. "What are you doing here?" "I'm disappointed in you," Gavin stated. "I did not authorize this meeting. You cannot remove me from that which I created and own. Your disloyalty hurts me, Mr. McLaughlin. You will not have to deal with me any longer, then. You are dismissed from the Board of Trustees." "Sir, I beg you." "It will do you no good," Gavin insisted, waving his hand to silence him. "You are no longer part of us." "The majority rules," Lord McCann said boldly. "Sir," from a man dressed in brown and tan, "you have been a great leader in the past, but you are constantly absent and not really performing your presidential duties. You delegate them to Mr. McLaughlin. Then you come out of nowhere to push your power around. We just don't feel you are driven and motivated enough, nor very dependable. In my absence, you have done much worse than when I was here. Does this mean that the entire board is incompetent in the absence of their leader? Are all of you so blind?" "There will be no board if you dismiss us all," Lord McCarran chuckled. "You'll be all alone to foot your own bill. There are only so many men like us locally. Your threats mean nothing to me. Mr. Borders, please make a note that this meeting was a complete waste of time. Meeting adjourned." He glanced at the treasurer. "Lord McCarran, do not forget those documents and receipts next week." Gavin stared at the bar, waiting. Down came a shot, and down went a shot. "Ah, that was good. Bring another. Don't stop until I say." "Aye, sir," from the bartender. Gavin took a sip of the martini he had been nursing on between shots of whiskey. Catapulting into the stool beside him and spinning around like an immature child, his kilt riding up his thighs, was Angus. "Gavin! Fancy seeing you here. I ain't seen you in a pub for years." "I had decided to have a taste of my roots." "With a martini?" "I have a sophisticated side, Angus." But deep down, he downed another shot. "I'm all Scottish pride." He nudged the werewolf with a chuckle. "Pretty soon, I might just sound like you." "You're making fun of me." Gavin chuckled. "Join me, old friend. Let us be merry together." "Are we celebrating, or are we wallowing in our sorrows?" Angus asked as Gavin tapped the counter, having the bartender bring more whiskey. "A little of both. I fired Alistair today. Let's just say he can get a head start on his retirement. One obstacle gone. Rebuilding the morale and values of that board is going to be very challenging. So, for the most part, it's working out well. That'd be quite good." He slammed down his hand. Bartender, pump us full of so much alcohol that we dance jigs and reels on the tables and sing Gaelic tunes in our sleep. This man has been stiff for years. Let's loosen him up. The bartender chuckled, especially when Gavin followed suit. The pair was a great joy to the pub's regular patrons. Because of their immune systems, they took a long time to get drunk, but they were loose and happy rather swiftly. They were dragged to dance and even attempt to play some music, torturing the poor folk musicians' instruments. After many more drinks, they broke out in song. To them, it was heaven, but in reality, it sounded like dying animals, their accents all slurred. Angus was not able to keep up with the words, forgetting many of them, and decided to throw back his head and howl like a dog. Unaware of the instinct, the patrons laughed and patted him on the back as they all began to wave their beer steins. What a jolly place this place had become, and how Gavin had forgotten how much fun socializing could be. After this long night of merriment, Gavin and Angus stumbled out of the pub, leaning on one another, laughing and singing slurred songs. Gavin's words were slurred more so than Angus, and he had recreated his old brogue. Angus, I love you. I know, master. I know. I love you too. You know, you're... He poked the vampire in the nose. You're like a brother to me. And you? Gavin poked him back. You're as pretty as me bonny wee sister. You look just like her. But then, you're descended down from her loins. A few generations down, Gavin, Angus corrected. You know what you need. What'll that be? Breasts, he hissed, grabbing Angus's chest. Your lordship, Angus scolded, releasing him completely and letting his master fall on his face in the snow. Did they molest me in public? And don't even think of trying to drive the carriage. I'll do it. You're gassed, Gavin whined, rolling onto his back. I want to drive. Drop the accent. You sound funny when you aren't talking hot dog. Shh, Gavin whispered, sitting up. Don't tell Clementine about my little affair. Gavin, Angus shouted. Clementine is not here. And that affair of yours was a painting. Get up. The horses are probably frozen off their wee tails. And the snow is getting up my kilt. Angus, I'm old. You're younger than God. Now get up. You want to take me home? Gavin asked. Of course. You just want my body. Angus face-palmed, nearly ready to pull some hair from his head. Gavin was acting absolutely silly. Thought I had to drag you to the carriage by your legs. Gavin chuckled, opening his mouth to speak, but was interrupted by the sound of gunshots in the near distance. They both turned toward the sound, confused. Who would be shooting at this time of night? Well, so much for happy hour, Gavin sighed, forcing himself to his feet. Perhaps someone is being burgled. Let's go investigate. He'd be all right like this. Fear not, Angus. I can be as silly and drunkard as any human, but when it comes to time to be serious, that human mind is set aside so that I may focus with my superior vampire brain. He motioned for Angus to follow as he walked through the snow, through alleyways and by buildings. The snow was beginning to fall again, and it was getting hard to see. Even for the pair, it was a tough night to be out. Perhaps it was just a warning shot. Master, look! Angus pointed. In a snowbank on the side of the road, a body was face down, dressed in fine clothing. Gavin gasped and rushed towards the man, turning him onto his back. There were bloodstains in the snow, a bullet wound to the middle. It's Mr. Barders! Angus shouted. He's still alive, Gavin observed. We have to get him inside where it's warm so he can be treated. The cold weather slowed his bleeding, but he could freeze to death in lieu of... He turned. Angus, go fetch the fiend who did this. Angus stood as tall as he could. He listened through the whistling wind, hearing footsteps running away in the crisp whiteness. He transformed right then and there before throwing back his head in a howl. He then bounded off like a hungry hound on the hunt. Gavin, meanwhile, tapped at Mr. Border's face. Mr. Borders! Mr. Borders, answer me! Come on, Frank, wake up! Slowly, Mr. Borders began to wake, glancing at Gavin, almost as if not believing. Are you an angel? Am I dead? You're not dead. Just hold on, Frank. I'm going to get you some help. I'm not going to make it to Glasgow, he panted. He put a hand on his bleeding belly. I'll take you to the children's hospital then. They can stabilize you until you're good enough to travel. You can't. Please, Gavin. He frowned. He scooped the man up, heading towards the carriage. He had to take him somewhere to be treated, and if he couldn't go to a doctor in a hospital at this hour, he'd give him the next best thing. In order to keep him conscious, he kept engaging Mr. Borders in conversation. If he could just keep him conscious long enough, it would be possible he could find a way to stabilize him. He had brought the man to his mansion, carrying him effortlessly inside, and placing him in a guest room where he undressed him and began to clean the wound, hoping to prevent infection and making it so he could see clearly. Gavin was no doctor, but after many decades of dealing with the fences of life and death, he felt he knew enough to save or take away this man's life. He glanced at Mr. Borders' face, resting a hand on his cheek and looking into his eyes. I need you to relax, all right? I need you to trust me. Trust, he whispered, feeling a warm calm coming over him. Was he dying? He couldn't even become frightened of the notion as he closed his eyes and began to sleep peacefully. Gavin then examined the wound. He almost wanted to make a joke, but it was a rather moot point now with Mr. Borders in mental suspension. Right, so the only thing to do would be to get to work, which he did. Cutting the wound further to have access... Right, so the only thing to do would be to get to work, which he did, cutting the wound further to have access to the guts inside. His eyesight was much keener than that of any human doctor. This worked to his advantage, as did his keener sense of smell. He could smell the lead and gunpowder. It didn't take long to find the little round lead pellet and remove it. It was actually easier than he had thought. He stopped the bleeding and checked for anything he might have missed. Finding nothing, he reached up and plucked the long hair from his head, and threading a needle with it, closed the wound. This would seem idiotic to anyone of the medical profession, but no doctor in the world would likely know the strength of a vampire's hair. It was about that time that Mr. Borders began to mutter in a suspended sleep. It caught Gavin's attention, and he glanced at the man's face. Are you all right, Frank? My Bonnie lies over the ocean. My Bonnie lies over the sea, he sang quietly. Really, Frank? That's nice, he chuckled. Now just keep resting. You'll be good enough to go in no time. You're so generous, he whispered. He reached up and grabbed onto Gavin's shirt, which surprised him, but he did nothing to remedy it. Your lordship, if I don't make it, you can have my wife. Gavin closed his eyes and shook his head. Okay, now this was just getting a little strange for him. He took hold of Mr. Borders' hand and sighed. Thank you. I'm very honored, Frank, but I don't think that'll be necessary. You'll be fine. Tomorrow, you'll be good enough to travel to Glasgow to a real hospital. Angus stopped at a dark intersection. He shook, trying to get some of the snow that had matted on his fur to fly off. He sniffed at the cobblestones, unable to pick up much of a scent. This weather was terrible for tracking when one has had far too much to drink. The wind was being rather unreliable as well. He snarled, picking up a small inkling of a scent and rushing after it. The most recent was the one he wanted, so off he pursued further. He stopped short, standing at the end of another road. He was wondering once again if he had lost his prey, only to have a shot fired at him. He let out a yelp before falling backwards and trying to find the gunman. The snow was so heavy that he barely saw things right in front of him, let alone things at a distance. "Show yourself!" he growled. "Who are you?" A shift of the wind made his ears go erect. He grit his teeth and snarled aggressively. There was more than one man, and he couldn't tell just how many or exactly where they were, but they were close. Another shot was fired as he leapt up and darted into the alleyway for cover. He leaned against the wall, continuing to growl like an angry dog. The fur on the back of his neck stood and his tail stuck straight out behind him. So they wanted to play it that way. How unfair, really. There were multiple armed men against one unarmed werewolf. "Did I walk into a trap?" he panted, his hot breath coming out like a dragon's smoke from his mouth. He heard footsteps approaching and slunk back into the darkness, watching carefully. One of those fools was coming to look for him. That would prove to be a fatal mistake, and indeed it was. One of the gunmen had come towards the alleyway, trying to see into the darkness. It would be hard enough on a clear night, and pretty much impossible on a night like this. In the next instant, Angus lunged from the nothingness and bit onto the figure's arm, making him send off another round before dropping the gun. He grabbed onto the figure's other arm as he cried out in surprise, fear, and pain. He picked him up, making his whole helpless body vibrate from the intense snarling booming from the mighty wolven chest. So different from the small boy he was before. He then went wide-eyed and dropped the man into the snow. "It cannot be!" he growled angrily, placing a clawed foot on his chest. "Graham Haggard, St. Raphael's head of public relations. This one ain't look good in your line of work, Mr. Haggard." "Monster!" Graham cried out. "You disgusting monster! What are you?" Angus moved his foot up, the long canine claws as sharp as daggers pressed against the bottom of Graham's throat. "You're a foolish man. I cannot allow you to leave tonight." "What are you going to do?" He curled his lips into a dark canine grin. "I'm going to feed the dog, Mr. Haggard. Good night, and goodbye." Graham's eyes went wide. "No, no," he pleaded as Angus lifted his foot from him. "No!" he screamed as the werewolf lunged forward for his throat. He sang the song of his satisfied victory afterwards by throwing his head back in a howl.